Interactive color legend. Whenever you have a color legend, there's an opportunity to make it interactive. Users could click or hover over the entries in the color legend to do either dynamic filtering or just to highlight the ones that match that color. For example, in this piece, you can hover over the items in the color legend to make the corresponding slices highlight. This is super useful because it lets the viewer interact with the visualization to answer specific questions. For example, you could ask, what are the most populous Muslim majority countries, by just hovering over this entry in the color legend. And boom, they pop right out. Let's implement this technique in our scatter plot. Once you figure out how to do it, you can apply this technique to any visualization where there's a color legend. I'll start by forking this scatter plot with color legend and renaming it to interactive color legend. To make this happen, we're going to revisit the idea of a unidirectional data flow. First, we'll render the original plot and color legend, and then when the user sees it and decides to hover over the color legend, that interaction will happen, which will trigger some sort of event listener, and then, based on that, we will change our state. In our case, the state will be which item is hovered over. And then based on that, we will re-render the app and start the cycle again. This will be our general approach to making this interactive color legend happen. In our code, where do we start? Well, what I'm thinking is, as you hover over these, the corresponding dots could pop out and everything else could fade to the background. We need to add some event listeners to these items here to know when the mouse is hovered over them and also when the mouse leaves them. Over in ColorLegend.js, let's see what we've got. I think we should be able to add an event listener to this group element, which contains everything else. And that event listener should fire if you hover over either the circle or the text, which I think is the desired behavior. I think there's an event called onMouseEnter that we can listen to like this. OnMouseEnter equals, for now I'm just going to make it a function that does console.log hovered. Now, if I hover over those entries, we get this output. It says hovered. All right, sweet. But which of these things was hovered over? Instead of outputting hovered, we can output domain value, because that's in scope here, because we're inside of this .map callback. Now, if I hover, it outputs Virginica, or Versicolor, or Setosa. All right, sweet. Now we've got what we need to set our state. We've got this far with the event listener. The next step is to change our state. But in our code, who should be responsible for this state? As in, which component should have this state in it? In the React world, there's a notion of a smart component and a dumb component. A smart component has state inside of it, and a dumb component doesn't. Typically, the smart component orchestrates a bunch of dumb components, and that way the structure of the program is pretty easy to reason about. I think I'd like to keep the color legend as a dumb component. We can do that by having it accept a callback in its props. That way, index.js can define the state and define the callback, and all ColorLegend needs to do is relay that information that, hey, somebody hovered over me. What that looks like in the code is we can introduce a new prop. Let's call it onHover. Then, in our onMouseEnter callback, instead of passing domain value to console.log, we can pass it to onHover. Now when we hover, this function that gets passed in as a prop will be invoked. The next thing we need to do is pass something in as onHover from index.js. Here's where we're invoking the color legend, and here's where we can pass in onHover For now, I'll just define a function that takes as input the hovered value and then logs out that value to the console, just to make sure everything is still working. In the console, when we hover, all right, it still works. Great. Now that we know that this is generally working, I'm going to change it to be setHoveredValue. The idea is that this function will set the state of our hovered value. So let's define setHoveredValue. At the top of our app, we will invoke useState, which will give us the hovered value, the state itself, and setHoveredValue, the setter for that state. Right now, the initial state is undefined, but I think I'd like to use null just to signify that nothing is hovered. Now we can test if this works by saying console.log hovered value. And it says null, null. That makes sense because the first time this runs, the data is not loaded yet, and the second time the data is loaded. But now let's check. If I hover, all right, it says Virginica, Versicolor, Setosa. Great. Now that we've got this state, what do we do with it? Well, you know, to do what we want to do with the fading and the hovering, we're going to need to filter the data to only include a subset that matches the hovered value. Here's where we're fetching our data and using it. It may be tempting to overwrite data with the filtered data, but that's not wise because then we lose the reference to the original data and we can only filter it once at that point. So we keep data as is, and we want our filtering to go after this guard because if the data is not there, there's nothing to filter. So down here, we can say const filtered data equals data.filter using JavaScript array's built-in filter method. We can pass in a function that accepts as input D, one row of our table. And this function should output true or false. True if D should be included in the resulting filtered array, and false if it should be excluded. So what do we want to do, really? We want to compare hovered value. Is hovered value the same thing as the color value of D? But color value is not defined yet. Color value is defined down here. I'm going to move this declaration of filtered data to be down after color value so that we can use the definition of color value. All right, so now we are ready to complete this function. It should return true if hovered value is the same as color value of D. That should give us the filtered data that only includes the rows where the species matches the hovered species. One cool thing we can do just to check if that's working is that instead of passing all the data into our marks, we can just pass in filtered data. And we don't see anything now, but if we hover, all right, see that? We just get the one that we're hovering over at the moment. All right, we're making some progress. This is pretty cool, and this might be useful in some situations. But we're not quite done because the effect that I'm going for is that all of the points should remain in the background, but these points should be the ones on top or highlighted. Also, when your mouse exits these entries, it should go back to showing everything. So let's try to implement some of those. Let's start with the layering idea. Since we already have a marks component, what we can do is render the marks of the filtered data after rendering the marks for all the data. In order to fade out these marks, we can put them inside of a group element like this, and we can make everything inside of that group element semi-transparent by setting the opacity to, for example, 0.5, 50% see-through. Now we're starting to get that effect. All right, sweet. What if we try 0.2? Okay, now they're really faded out. I like that. What we have now is a bit problematic though, because if nothing is selected, all we see is the faded out points. But in the case that nothing is selected, I think the fade should not be there at all. They should not be faded out. We can accomplish this by conditionally setting the opacity. If there is some hovered value, then set the opacity to 0.2. Otherwise, set it to 1, meaning not transparent at all. Okay, now we're seeing all of these marks rendered at full opacity, and then when we hover, that's when these get highlighted. All right, so far so good. The last remaining thing we need to do is handle the case where our mouse hovers off of these things. When that happens, hoveredValue should be set back to null so that everything draws in full opacity again. For that, we need to add another event listener in our ColorLegend. In ColorLegend.js, we've already got this onMouseEnter event listener. There's another event listener called onMouseOut. This triggers when the mouse exits the surface of whatever it was hovering over. In this case, we can call onHover and pass in null. Null being our Sentinel value that signals that nothing is currently hovered. Now, if we hover and then we unhover, everything goes back to showing at full opacity. Sentinel value, by the way, is just a good term to know. It just means it's a special value that signifies a certain case. The value of null is often used as a sentinel value to indicate nothingness. Null has this intentionality to it, where you're intentionally defining something to be null as a sentinel value, as opposed to undefined, which is sort of the default thing that variables are when you just don't define them. That's why I'm using null in the code as opposed to undefined to signal this sentinel value of nothing being hovered. So that's what a sentinel value is. Minor detour. Back in our code though, let's see what we've got. The hovering is working, but there is some minor cleanup that could be done. Namely, I'm a bit irritated by this cursor, this text selection cursor. It's not really a big deal, but we can control it, so I'd like to fix that. We can do that by setting the cursor of our tick text to be something. I always have to look these up. If you just Google CSS cursor and go to the MDN link, you can find this nice list of possible cursors. Pointer usually indicates you can interact with something, but I would like to use default just so that that text cursor doesn't appear. So we can set cursor to be default, and now we just get the default cursor over there. Okay, great. The last minor piece of cleanup I'd like to do is make it so that these other legend items also fade out as you hover. It's kind of weird that the points on the plot fade out, but the color legend, the ones that you're not hovering, they stay full opacity, so let's address that. Over in index.js, when we render our color legend, one thing we can do is just take the same approach that we took with the marks by putting this color legend inside of a group element that has this conditional opacity. All right, this is not getting the desired behavior because what we need to do is pass in a color scale with a different domain or something like that. Or you know what? This might not be the right approach at all. It might be better, since ColorLegend is aware of hovering, if we just pass in a hovered value. This way, in the ColorLegend is where we can deal with the opacity. We can unpack hovered value here, and then this group element can have opacity. And that can be if the domain value matches the hovered value, then the opacity could be 1. Otherwise, we can set the opacity to 0.2. Now they're all showing as faded, but if we do hover, we get the desired effect. We need to handle the case where there is no hovered value. We can rephrase this a bit to say, if hovered value is defined and the domain value does not equal the hovered value, then we give it an opacity of 0.2. Otherwise, we give it an opacity of 1. This way, if there is no hovered value, it's going to short circuit and we're going to have opacity of 1 like we see here. But if there is a hovered value, then it's going to do this check, and for all values that are not the hovered value, they'll have this opacity here. So this is the desired effect. All right, perfect. I'll just reformat that. And one last thing is, I don't like how 0.2 is duplicated in 2 different places. I'd prefer if this were a variable, let's call it fade opacity. Then we can unpack a new prop, fade opacity, and then over in index.js, we can define fade opacity to be 0.2, and then when we invoke our color legend, we can pass in fade opacity equals fade opacity, and we can finally replace 0.2 with fade opacity. All right, now we're getting the desired behavior. Sweet, this is exactly how it should be. Everything's fading in the right places. To recap, we're setting up our state right here. Hovered value, set hovered value. The default hovered value is null, our Sentinel value to indicate that nothing is hovered. Oh, I can get rid of this console.log there. And then down in our code, we're computing filtered data to be data.filter. If the color value of D is the same as the hovered value, then that row is included in the filtered data. Then when we render our marks, we render all the data inside of this group element that has this fade opacity if there is something hovered. And on top of that, we rendered the filtered data marks. And by the way, if there is no hovered value, filtered data is an empty array, so this doesn't actually render anything in that case. Finally, when we render our color legend, we're passing in the hovered value, and the color legend itself takes care of setting the opacity on these groups based on which one is hovered. That's how you can set up an interactive color legend, and I want to emphasize you can do this on any visualization that has a color legend. That's all for interactive color legend.